Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Emma. Okay, so Zara, we know that the government has moved in recent weeks to crack down on mis- and disinformation. This conversation around overhauling and regulating social media is really front and centre at the moment. But I want you to set the stage for me specifically on this idea of mis- and disinformation. What is the problem the government's trying to solve here?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because, as you said, there's so many different laws being floated at the moment and they can kind of all start to get a bit confusing.
Yep.
But today we're talking about mis- and disinformation. And if you haven't heard those terms before, they do mean different things. So I think a good starting point is to just break down those terms. So misinformation is the spreading of false information unknowingly, essentially. So it's someone who believes that what they're sharing is correct, but it isn't. And they post something to Facebook that they heard, their uncle say at a Christmas dinner, and that's how that information spreads. That is different from disinformation, which is when someone knowingly spreads false information. So those are the differences between mis- and disinformation, and that's really what the government is trying to crack down on. They're trying to say this is spreading so wildly online and especially on social media, we need to come in and try to regulate it in some way. They had some polling when they announced their legislation from the Australian Media Literacy Alliance that said that 80% of Australians said the spread of misinformation on social media needed to be addressed. And I think that was what really was pushing this move, that they think that Aussies want to see this crackdown and they want to meet them there.
So like we said, there is this conversation at the moment around social media regulations and making the internet a safer place. But the issue specifically of mis- and disinformation isn't really a new one. I feel like this conversation hit the mainstream majorly in 2016.
Fake news.
Yeah, the fake news era, the Donald Trump election campaign when he first became president. So it's definitely been a present issue online for the better part of a decade. Why are we talking about it now?
Well, now is not actually the first time that we have had this conversation here in Australia. And that's because the Albanese government actually introduced legislation last year to address this very same issue. This is just the second attempt at that legislation. And that's because last year when they published the draft of what they wanted their misinformation bill to look like, they got so much criticism. So essentially what they did was they published a draft. They said, this is what we want to do. This is how we think it should look. And then they opened it up for public consultation. And public consultation just means asking the public their opinions. I don't know if they would live to regret that decision, but ultimately the feedback was really strong. And I think if we go to the essence of that criticism, it was that the legislation that the government had come to the table with had really broad definitions of what misinformation, disinformation and harm meant. Okay. And so there were concerns that that might create a bit of a slippery slope, that if we aren't using specific examples, could that then infringe on free speech? If one person says that something's misinformation, another person says that it's the truth, who's deciphering that? And so that was really the key there. And, we had so many people come out against that legislation. The Australian Human Rights Commission did. They said that the terms in the legislation were broad and vague. They said that this risked enabling unpopular or controversial opinions or beliefs to be subjectively labelled as misinformation or disinformation and censored as a result. So fairly big claims there. And it wasn't just the Human Rights Commission. At the time, the coalition was arguing the same point. They said the proposal will lead to digital companies self-censoring the legitimately held views of Aussies to avoid the risk of massive fines. And so the government heard that and they were like, all right, we hear you. And they took that legislation away and did some work.
Okay, so some pretty significant concerns that were raised by a spectrum of groups, sides of politics, advocacy groups, these concerns around the broadness and the vagueness of the bill. What did the government then go away and do with those arguments? What has it done to kind of shore up the misinformation and disinformation approach?
Yeah, so they spent quite a bit of time on this. As I said, last year was when we first saw that last bill. It was only last week that we then saw the second version of that. So they've had, almost a year to be working on this. Here was Communications Minister Michelle Rowland introducing the legislation.
The top priority of the government is to keep its citizens safe. Doing nothing to protect Australians from seriously harmful mis- and disinformation online is simply not an option.
So what is actually in this bill?
I think that there are two main parts that we can talk about. The first is the responsibilities of the digital platforms themselves, and then the second is the responsibility of Australia's media regulator. And we'll go through one at a time. So the first is the responsibility of the digital platforms. And so under this legislation, platforms would be required to basically be very transparent about their policies, their strategies, and how they are dealing with mis- and disinformation on their platforms. So they'd be required to publish publicly their misinformation and disinformation policies, their risk management strategies, and their media literacy plans. And I think that that's a really interesting one. It's something we obviously talk a lot about here at TDA, which is, it's one thing for a platform to say this is misinformation or disinformation. It's another for a user to be able to critically analyze.
Yeah, because a big part of misinformation, as you mentioned, defining it, is about people mistakenly sharing information that is not true, inaccurate content, but oftentimes they don't even know they're doing that. So how do we help users identify that kind of content?
Yeah, and so that's really at the heart of the government's legislation. It's saying the onus is on the platforms to come up with those media literacy plans that will help to encourage more critical thinking among users. And I'd never really seen that before. That's what the onus on the platforms is. And then on the other side, there's quite a bit in the legislation about giving Australia's media regulator more powers. And so that's about, being able to ensure that ACMA, which is the Australian Communications and Media Authority, they have the tools and the skills necessary to closely monitor the digital platforms, to suggest if those platforms are abiding or not abiding by the rules, and also to issue fines to companies if they find out that they're not complying.
So ACMA would act as this watchdog, or is a watchdog on the government's behalf, just kind of checking in and seeing if best practices are being upheld and then taking action if they are not.
Exactly. And I think it's important to note, though, that ACMA won't have the authority to take down individual pieces of content. This is something that's come up before. We've spoken on this pod about Elon Musk and X, and the e-safety commissioner has issued takedown notices in that scenario. What those powers would actually look like in reality would depend on, I guess, the compliance of the platforms themselves. So the idea is that ACMA shouldn't have to intervene if we are seeing compliance. But I think, the reality is that that's always going to be a difficult thing. And so we'd see ACMA then stepping in as kind of the government's ear to the ground per se, and trying to limit the mis and disinformation they're seeing on those platforms.
The one question that isn't kind of immediately answered for me in terms of the government going away, reconsidering this legislation, is concern around those vague definitions of what misinformation, disinformation and harm actually looks like. What constitutes a piece of content that ticks one or some of those boxes. So what has changed in this updated version to address that issue?
Yeah, so the way that they've addressed it is that they have defined misinformation or disinformation as something that's verifiably false, misleading or deceptive and can contribute to serious harm. And so it's there in serious harm that they've really nutted down the definition. And I'll just read you straight from the legislation how they define serious harm, because, even that is such a subjective term. What serious harm to me is absolutely not serious harm to you. But I'll read here from the Act. It says, serious harm is defined as harm to the operation of government or public health, the vilification of a group, physical injury, damage to critical infrastructure, or imminent harm to the economy.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they're saying there it's not so much about defining what mis and disinformation are as much as defining what the effect on individuals, on groups, on government, on the economy actually looks like in practice. I think that this would rub up against other pieces of legislation, like defining what vilification or hate speech looks like, but that's seemingly a matter for the government.
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously, this definition has come from real examples or real world consequences of what harmful content online can do to an individual and a community and society more broadly. A lot seems to be rooted in anti-discrimination as well
public
as
health.
public safety. Yeah.
Which I think is obviously the answer to COVID.
Yeah, exactly. So we've run through how the government wants to stop this spread of misinformation and disinformation online. We've got these things like media literacy, giving greater powers to regulatory bodies. But what happens if, for example, a tech company doesn't want to play ball? We've seen this play out with that example
So
of
many
Elon
times.
Musk and e-safety many times. So what happens when platforms don't want to publish their media literacy strategies, don't want to come to the table? We're talking about global
Behemoths.
we're talking about behemoths, global media platforms. What's the Australian government to them?
I mean, a bigger question, a podcast in and of itself, and the government has obviously planned for this hypothetical. As I said earlier, no one is under any illusions that big tech is here to play ball with the government whenever they wish. But the way that the government has figured out a penalty is that if a digital platform breaches this law, it could face penalties of up to 5% of its annual global revenue.
Wow.
Now, I am innumerate, so I did not know that was a big deal. I saw that and I was like, oh, that's a tiny percentage.
Not when we're talking billions of profits.
Correct. So I did the numbers I just took a random company. I took Meta just because they're always front of mind.
Yep.
So if we use Meta as an example, it turned over $134 billion last year. Mind blowing.
Hang on. Sorry. $134 billion. That is a lot
So much money.
of money.
I tell you what else is a lot of money, 5% of that. So if and I'm just saying this is absolutely just a hypothetical. No one is insinuating there's been any wrongdoing from Meta. But if we were taking this hypothetical one step further, if they breached this new law after it had passed Parliament, Meta would be looking at a $6.7 billion fine from the Australian government. So that's the stick that the government is saying they will use if big tech does not play ball when it comes to this new legislation.
Yeah, and this gets us into the territory that we have been discussing a lot lately, this idea of governments trying to regulate multinational companies. So exactly as we described, X is based in the US. If it's at war with an Australian lawmaker, or the other example of X in Brazil recently, where we saw the platform being blocked in the country because it did not
comply
with regulatory standards. How has big tech responded to these plans from the Australian government to limit mis and disinformation on their platforms?
Well, I'm glad that you used the X example, because anyone that clicked on this podcast will have seen Elon Musk in the title. And that's because of all the tech platform owners, he has come out the strongest, I think, in news that will surprise nobody.
Yeah. When we say
lots of strong opinions.
When we say we're not sure if tech's going to play ball with the government's approach, what we really mean is X, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's be honest.
So shortly after this draft legislation was unveiled by the government, Elon Musk came out very strongly against the proposal. He labelled the Australian government as fascists in a one-worded tweet.
That's strong.
Yeah, then days later he doubled down saying far-left fascists love censorship. And we know that he was talking there about the Australian government. The Labor Party is left of centre. He's really drilled down in his position against this legislation. Australian PM Anthony Albanese has hit back at Elon Musk. He said that social media companies have a social responsibility, and he said, and I quote here, "If Mr. Musk doesn't understand that, that says more about him than it does about my government." It's not just Anthony Albanese that's had a lot to say within the government. I had to include this quote from Labor Minister Bill Shorten, who is, of course, retiring at the next election. He said, and I quote, "Elon Musk has more positions on our free speech than the Kama Sutra."
Wow. Bill Shorten.
Had to explain what that meant in the office. That was a good day at work. But of course, looking at this policy more generally, as we said at the top of this podcast, it hasn't happened in a vacuum. It is very clear that the Albanese government is going pretty hard with kind of a suite of reforms across the board on regulating social media and big tech in the country. Just last week, we spoke about a social media ban for children. Then yesterday, we had Instagram announce that it's now introducing teen accounts.
Yeah.
And, some are saying that perhaps that could be linked. And then before that, we've spoken about the options that the government's looking at to go back to Meta with, because they have refused to pay for news here. And so there are lots of kind of live debates about how the Australian government deals with these multinational companies who operate in so many jurisdictions but dictate so much of our lives. And that's a really big challenge that this government and any future governments really have on their hands.
Yeah, it's amazing to kind of zoom out and consider all of those very live issues, very hot button topics playing out in the Australian landscape, and then considering that, all around the world, these issues are being grappled with by governments and users everywhere. Back to specifically this legislation around mis and disinformation, we know what the government's position is, but what about the other side of politics? Have we heard from the opposition?
Yeah, so the coalition opposed the previous draft, the one that I was telling you about before. At the time, they said it would suppress legitimate free speech in Australia. And then speaking to the ABC after the introduction of this new legislation, Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman said that if the new bill is anything like the last one, then we will have a lot of problems. So it doesn't seem like the coalition's necessarily on board with it, but they did say that they were taking the time to go through it and understand what was included in it. One of David Coleman's colleagues, Alex Antic, who's a coalition senator, said, and I quote, "This will serve as a great big wet blanket over the top of free speech." He is naturally to the right of some of his colleagues, so I don't know that that's necessarily the view of the whole party, but we're getting a sense of where the coalition might come down on this one. In terms of other political parties, the Greens' spokesperson for communications, Sarah Hanson-Young, said, "It's clear that the global tech giants are unwilling to act in the public interest without strong regulation and enforcement." She did say that the Greens would make sure that the government's legislation was assessed through a Senate inquiry. So she's saying that they would refer it onto a committee for greater kind of interrogation.
But it sounds like the Greens are potentially more on board with these sorts of crackdowns for tech giants while the coalition reviews the legislation in its updated form. Zara, thank you so much for taking us through that today. As we said, there are just so many conversations going on in this space, so it's really helpful for us to be able to pause and look at something like this a little more closely. As always, as these issues continue to play out, we will continue to keep you updated on the Daily Aus. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you are listening to us or watching us over on YouTube. We will be back with another episode tomorrow. Until then, have a great day.